Unit 29. Gateway. There is obviously a wide gap between the promises of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the real world of human rights violations. Insofar as we sympathize with the victims, we may criticize the UN and its member governments for failing to keep their promises. However, we cannot understand the gap between human rights ideals and the real world of human rights violations by sympathy or by legal analysis. Rather, it requires investigation by the various social sciences of the causes of social conflict and political oppression, and of the interaction between national and international politics. The UN introduced the concept of human rights into international law and politics. The field of international politics is, however, dominated by states and other powerful actors, such as multinational corporations that have priorities other than human rights. It is a leading feature of the human rights field that the governments of the world proclaim human rights but have a highly variable record of implementing them. We must understand why this is so. Exercise 1. In the United States, the coming of the railroads opened up local and regional markets to competition. Local producers had difficulty competing with large manufacturers, and many local companies went out of business or merged with other firms producing similar foods. The shipment of dressed beef from the Midwest to eastern cities, for instance, all but eliminated local slaughterhouses and reduced the number of butchers. In 1860, New York City had more than 2,000 butchers, but only a few hundred survived in 1900. These butchers had counted on their customers' appreciation of the quality and flavor of their meats, but shoppers readily gave up locally butchered beef and pork for cheaper cuts shipped from the Midwest. Exercise 2. There are limits to the idea of timeless fashion. Fashions from the Victorian era or from Elizabethan times do not appear cool or fashionable now, no matter who wears them. Indeed, it is interesting to consider whether the concept of cool can be applied to historical eras, in which fashion is constrained by social and gender conventions to a far greater degree than is the case in most modern liberal societies. It's hard to imagine a woman dressed in Jane Austen-era clothes as cool, even though she might be fashionable given the standards of the time. Historical figures who might qualify as cool, such as Lord Byron, are individuals who had a degree of financial and/or social freedom, usually arriving from wealth and leisure, that allowed them to exercise their aesthetic choices in a way that was not possible for individuals who were more constrained by convention and circumstance. Perhaps, then, being cool is also a matter of having freedom to exercise one's tastes and the resources to be able to do this. Exercise 3. Politicians, especially those in the national spotlight, are often jokingly accused of being narcissists, but in all seriousness, their profession lends itself to this particularly destructive personality trait. For example, in order to be a successful candidate, you have to be unnaturally optimistic, even in the face of probable defeat, and possess high levels of self-esteem, despite the constant criticism that comes with the territory. Furthermore, you are constantly given sole credit for successes, even though those successes were achieved in part by the work of many aides and assistants. Finally, you constantly have people relying on you, believing in you, and holding you responsible as the sole representative of a cause. All of this power can lead to an exaggerated sense of self-importance that can cause some individuals to believe that the world revolves around them. That's when their out-of-control behaviors become easier to rationalize. Exercise 4. Many of those who oppose globalization reserve their highest loyalties to the sovereign state, which they believe exists to protect their interests. They argue that in democratic states, such as those in Europe and North America, citizens have a voice in determining their own fates, but have little or no voice in the boardrooms of giant transnational corporations, remote international bureaucracies like the EU or WTO, or economic markets, and such institutions are not accountable to citizens. Thus, anti-globalizers argue globalization has created a democratic deficit by empowering institutions in which people have no voice and unleashing economic and cultural forces over which they have no control. Globalization, they believe, is eroding the rights and capacity of people to determine their own future. The result is alienation and anxiety, as people's lives are troubled by remote forces beyond their control or understanding. Unit 29. Gateway. There is obviously a wide